Namaste and welcome to the Festival of Bharat. As you are aware, we host conversations that resonate with the idea, the philosophy, and the spirit that is Bharat. Our discussions revive the ancient methods of civilized debate and discussion, or Vad and Samvad, as we would call it. During the course of our conversations, many of which are introspective, we delve deeper into the reasons of how Bharat of our ancestors became the India that we know today. And today's interaction is one such. During my work in the developmental space as a grassroots social worker, my team and I often came across issues and situations where we clearly saw that the ground reality was vastly different and many times completely opposite of what is presented as a narrative in mainstream media. Today's discussion is about the inside story of how a narrative gets built and communicated, often with a pre-decided agenda. And more importantly, how qualitative research plays a role in putting this false narrative out there. To help us understand this better, we have a special guest who's an expert in qualitative research, Dr. Sarita Seshagiri. Let me introduce our guest. Dr. Sarita Seshagiri holds a doctorate in political science from the National University of Singapore. She has a master's in political science from Jawaharlal Nehru University, a bachelor's in history from Lady Shri Ram College, New Delhi. After her doctorate, she joined some of the leading multinationals in mobile technology as a user experience researcher in their research divisions. She has been a visiting faculty at the International Institute of Information Technology in Bengaluru. She has held several workshops on research methods and qualitative field immersions in institutes such as National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, Indian Institute of Technology in Guwahati, Maharashtra Institute of Technology in Pune, and International Institute of Information Technology, to name a few. Dr. Seshagiri has presented papers in leading conferences on human-computer interaction, user behavior, and social technology. Sarita ji, welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Namaste, and thank you for having me over.
Sarita ji, the first question is, in the context of how a narrative gets built, can you help us understand what is qualitative research and how does it play a role in this?
Right. So that's a very fundamental question that all of us need to understand. The thing is, qualitative field studies and social science research have almost become synonymous with each other today. So one of the reasons is that most social science branches occupy themselves with the study of people, their systems of interacting with each other and creating outcomes for one another. So to this end, study methods that are conducive for understanding people, for the researchers to easily intermingle with the respondents is adopted. And qualitative field studies typically enable field immersions to study people and to gather information about the people and understand them in their natural setting. So it involves typically direct face-to-face, especially ethnographic methods, which are qualitative in nature, require face-to-face interactions with the respondents, between the researchers and the respondents. And it enables data gathering to be contextually proximate to the people or the phenomenon that's being studied. And qualitative ethnographic field research, if I may say so, by that virtue is said to be closer to the truth than other methods. Now, it is important to understand social phenomena, both in terms of the behavioral and emotional characteristics. And that cannot be understood by quantitative methods, which is all about quantifying data. whereas qualitative data will really give you the whys, whereofs, and the context of data, of how people behave with each other, the kind of decisions they take for each other and for themselves. So the goal of qualitative ethnographic study is really to gain descriptors that will help to identify the drivers and the triggers that influence people's decision making, both as individuals and as groups. So this is really apt to gain dense information and to make data points really vivid and clear. So that's where qualitative research comes in, and it makes it attractive to most researchers because it provides the opportunity for researchers to interact with respondents over a long period of time. And that is essential in ethnographic studies, which is what qualitative research provides. The other thing I would like to say is to have this sort of an interaction between the respondents and the researchers. It requires a lot of expertise in being able to immerse oneself in the context of the users, in the context of the people. And for that reason, what it also needs is an apprenticeship or a mentor-mentee sort of a collaboration between the the person who is learning, understanding, learning to do the qualitative research, and the one who is the mentor. So in that sense, what can happen is that a mentor-mentee sort of a relationship can lead to adherence of some kind of specific theoretical constructs or biases that can get carried over from the mentor to the mentee in the course of time. So that's the answer to the question.
Wonderful. Thank you for putting it across in such a simple way for us laypersons to also comprehend. Sarita ji, one of the most misunderstood aspects about India is the idea of the so-called caste system. In one of your earlier interviews, I remember that you spoke about how the history of qualitative research in India paved the way for this incorrect understanding of Varna and Jati when it got translated into the European context of caste. Can you help us understand what that was all about and how it happened?
Sure. So the study of Indian social structure, culture, religion, economy, polity, all of them pretty much owe their roots to ethnographic traditions that was seeped in qualitative methods right from the beginning of the 20th century. During this time, there was a strong emphasis to gather data in terms of race and physical anthropology. So one of the earliest studies was by Dr. B.S. Guha, and that was both a ethnographic sort of a study, but at the same time, it was undertaken for census purposes. So naturally, as you can imagine, census data during this time became pretty much synonymous with caste data. And that is how British officials such as J.H. Hutton, E.H. Blunt, to name a few people who were involved in gathering data, they started producing books on India that was pretty much about the caste structure of India. So most of the qualitative field immersions at that time pretty much exclusively dealt with gathering caste and ethnographic data about northeastern tribes, the central and southern Indian tribes. So what happened is that it's worth noting that studies during this time that were initially undertaken by researchers involved themselves with caste. Now, the second thing I want to draw your attention to is that the researchers who were commissioned by the government, all these were the British Indian government sponsored researches that were taking place. And these researchers, eventually they paved the way for ethnographers who had a definite missionary purpose, such as Vernier Elwin. So by what we can say is the mid-20th century, qualitative inquiry of India's social structure began, especially sociological and anthropological studies, began following two major institutionalized ideas. One was the caste, as you rightly brought out, the other one was village. And that preoccupation with caste and village continues even today in our ethnographic traditions. Now, the Orientalist perception, they adopted the term caste from the European concept to give a generalized explanation for jati and varna, which was prevalent in India at this time. And they attributed its spread across the country as an exploitative, hegemonic sort of a system. And this was especially problematic because census officials of the late 19th century, they found it difficult to distinguish between caste, tribe, nationality, and they incorporated all these categories as variations of caste in their data collection. Now, if we look at our own Indian structure better, we will see that jati is not an entity that is homogeneous or uniform, and so it cannot serve as the unit of caste classification. And similarly, varna also cannot be the basis of caste classification because it too has, in fact, there's a lack of clarity and agreement, in understanding the normative and presumed conception of what they call as the caste system. Yet it was caste and varna that was taken as an explanation about Indian culture and society for several decades. Now, what happened is in the context of, if you look at the current caste-based judicial verdicts that have been given in the country over the years, we will see the thing is these are isolated facts that are conflated together as evidence of caste system. Now, such claims are legitimate only if the foundational ideas of caste can be proven as not being presuppositions. And one of the major challenges in discussions around social orders in India is that all properties were ascribed to the caste system, but not one of them was unique to India's so-called caste system. So if you look at hierarchy, if you look at purity, pollution, endogamy, occupational communities, to name a few, in fact, similar properties have also been found in social systems of Semitic origins. So a critical counterclaim to the dominant constructs about India's caste as a dehumanizing, discriminatory system is that it crystallized in the European understanding of India and the Christian theological background that fashioned non-Abrahamic faith systems in the country. So understanding India's social phenomena, most of which are tried to caste system, needs basic fundamental reconceptualizing, especially when scholars themselves have not reached a consensus on several key areas. These also include how certain alleged castes were different from other kinds of human groups. We need to set that right. And how caste system came into being, we need to understand that, what sustained it, the relationship of caste to a so-called ordering of social hierarchy. So what are the constituents of these systems which are considered as necessary properties of the caste system? We need to lay that out clearly for the lay people, for other researchers. And at the same time, when they speak of caste systems' relation to social conflict, it can't be in general terms. They need to really specify what and how it is. So newer perceptions ought to have developed since researchers after the 19th century, which took on socioethnographic styles of inquiry about India. But these are unfortunately, again, paradigms that are borrowed constructs on India-specific framework. And research efforts actually have, again, become constricted by these restrictive paradigms. In fact, ethnographic studies in India are no less affected by this, rural India are no less affected by this trend. What I'm trying to say is they do not lack in merit, and but what they lack is an India-specific approach with an introspection of these dominant constructs that have been carried over. In fact, what I would say is field research efforts should be attuned to understanding the nuances of contextual observations by engaging with respondents and gathering their narratives rather than extrapolating findings to validate Western constructs of caste and varna and so-called jati.
Incredible and so true. I think what you just shared is a very crucial piece in our understanding of how Varna and Jati got reduced to caste and what we need to keep in mind going forward. Sarita ji, during the course of my field work, I came across research proposals which seemed to have a pre planned or a pre decided outcome. Sometimes that was the goal of the funding agency, and at other times, it seemed like the research institute itself decided that, well, now it's time for a particular narrative to be set. And then they roll out proposals and studies revolved around that pre decided outcome. So, can you talk a little about the possible bias, including the bias from funders in the field of qualitative research, and how the outcomes of such biased qualitative research studies can be misused? If in the process you can give us a few samples from something that happened in India, that would be very helpful.
Right. Right. So actually, many preconceptions and constructs are brought into qualitative study, as you rightly said, and they determine in turn the field immersion activities. So funders, of course, can skew the outcomes due to their predetermined mandates. In fact, they often seek anticipated outcomes from projects, which is further exacerbated by two things, that is paucity of time and financial resources. So there was this recent project that I worked in, and it was funded by a well-known international donor agency. And that had previously undertaken research in previous phases of it was in Asia and in Africa. And these were regions in Asia and Africa with comparable sort of socioeconomic indices that were comparable to India. So consequently, the donor had already identified opportunity areas to isolate and invest in before embarking upon a study in India. Now, in my interactions with foreign donor officials and the partnering academic institutes for this project, I noticed certain discrepancies. See, the study was termed as an exploratory research enterprise for the Indian team that included myself and my other co-researchers. But it was primarily a corroboration exercise for donors and the International Research Agency. So it was not an exploratory research, but an exercise in excuse me, but an exercise in corroboration. And there were previous requirements from the donors in terms of specific observations and findings that they wanted to be included in the study report from India. So it became clear when I met a donor representative and some other researchers after a month of field immersion. And this particular donor official told me in the course of our discussion, he said, now I'm quoting, quote unquote, he said, we have done parts of Africa and Asia, and we got communitarian tension. Now bring us religious, economic, and caste tension. You can get these quotes from participants. You will get that in the northern locations of India. Just bundle that up with some sort of identity sort of a thing. And, that's what they said. Now, the thing is, while scholars influence data, I am not denying the fact that scholars with their biases, researchers with their biases do influence data, but donors determine its direction. So in fact, there was an increasing pressure from donors every other day that field observations should be reported to them on an everyday. Fair enough, which is good enough. But then that quickly changed to delivering insights on a weekly basis. So raw findings were quickly modified into research insights and takeaways and was handed over to them. So unverified claims from preliminary interviews were put forth as insights. And these naturally included so-called instances of caste conflicts, of religious tensions, everything else that researchers obtained through what I would call as dubious means of interactions with respondents. So participants' individual outcomes in this process were positioned as explanations for larger social outcomes. And as you can see, as I began by answering your question, it was primarily directed by the funders.
I mean, there are so many instances of this that I can myself narrate. And as you said, just everything that I have lived through as a menstrual educator just flashed before my eyes. And at least this one incident I wish to share, where I was interviewed for about 2 hours by this very well-known large philanthropic organization. And they were looking to understand the so-called ground reality of menstrual hygiene in India. And I shared a lot of positive stories. I told them how what is projected out there is far from the truth. Girls are not dropping out of school. We certainly don't have lack of access to any of these hygiene products, including in the rural areas. And at the end of the interview, I felt so happy that, okay, I'm able to present the ground reality, which is actually a very positive thing. And in fact, there is no issue of menstrual hygiene. But to my utter surprise, Sarita ji, when that paper got published, there was not even a mention of my research. And instead, they had this list of other NGOs and people who, gave them what they need, which was a forced and negative representation of menstruation in India, which is far from the ground reality. So I completely understand what you are saying. I've experienced this so many times. And thank you for sharing that and giving us an insight into what really happens behind the scenes with researchers who get into this sort of studies. My next question to you, Sarita ji, is about how research gets influenced when there are people of non-Indian origin trying to understand our core culture or our traditional practices. Do biases set in that process? What sort of biases? And can you share a few examples if any of those incidents have happened during your field experience?
Certainly. In fact, this is going to be a bit of a longish answer because I'm going to quote from my own personal experience. And this has happened many times, but let me take the example again of the latest research study that I was part of with a team of other foreign academics with distinct profiles. So I will begin firstly with what their profiles were like. So most of the senior researchers in their academic positions had already been contributing to only specific theoretical paradigms centered around subversion, around gender, caste, religion, freedom, and so forth for several years. So most of their academic engagements had been in field studies that furthered these paradigms. Secondly, coming back to their profiles, they were familiar with either the larger user sample that we were set out to examine, or a subset of the sample. But they were all from previous projects, similar previous projects that had been undertaken in India. So at the very outset, there was the risk of skewed data selection, or what we call as cherry picking, to corroborate their own hypothesis. So the first thing that naturally flows from such a arrangement of things is that data can be nudged, the research design can be nudged in a certain direction. So like I said, they were already familiar with the sample, and so the study locations that they picked up was not just for the merit or for the suitability to address the research problem, because that was the basis on which obviously it was picked out. But there were also practical concerns, of what were the language skills of our field researchers, and all of that was perfectly fine. It was not unethical till then. It was not. But then what happened is that process of aligning the research design to pre-decided study locations. It was like working backwards. So that I found a little, unusual. And apart from that, within the first 10 days of field study, confirmation bias sort of set in, and it became apparent with the team's exposure to the very first 7 user interviews that were already undertaken. So from the reading of the first 7 user interviews, that interview transcripts, the multi-member research team was already geared towards forming their own conclusions, and for which they only sought further validation. And these were again macro themes on India's social systems, such as caste, religion, gender, and these were already encoded into the research study design. And as I said, they were all products of the team members' previous study engagements. Now, the present research, as you can imagine, served in this context, it served merely as a means to validate predetermined paradigms. And what were the predetermined paradigms of a polarized and conflict-ridden society? But there was also a marked tendency to seek what we call as convenience samples, where you go to locations where you can easily access the kind of respondents who fit your research requirements, be it crowded markets, shopping arcades, train stations, wholesale vegetable markets, and so on. Now, my problem is where most respondents who were recruited belong to a certain the same social background. And by social, I mean their religious and linguistic profiles were all the same. And they served as data points to corroborate predetermined paradigms. And I wonder if the study conclusions would have been different if the sample had varied members and if they had belonged to different religious groups. The second problem that happens when you have this sort of a team is where they lead respondents to desired responses. And this is where the real test of ethics happens, when data contradicts the scholar's accepted beliefs. And we call these as deviant data. And I refer to an instance of deviant field data, and that caught my attention because I was working alongside my co-researcher, who was a European. He had a working knowledge of Hindi, and he was all set to complete his doctoral research in a renowned American academic institute. And alongside that, he was also a faculty in another research organization. So the said co-researcher, he was at that time looking to combine his doctoral research questions with that of the project which we were involved in. Now, this is the instance. He asked a participant, and she belonged to a particular demographic background, and you will know what I'm getting at. So he asked her if she had participated in a campaign against the government in her state, and she answered in the negative. So he again asked her if she would have joined if her religious head had asked for it, had commanded for it, either on the mass media or social media. To that again, she answered in the negative. Then he asked her if she had ever felt, quote unquote, if she had ever felt threatened by members of the majority religion. And she responded yet again in the negative. So to this, my colleague asked, now he changed his track a bit, and he asked her, again, quote unquote, how you might feel if you're threatened by members of the majority religion in the future. So at the end of that interview, I asked my colleague the reason for his persistence to obtain an affirmative sort of a response to religious tension in the region. And his obvious answer was, I'm trying to tease out the problem as an outsider. So I remarked that our research mandate was to gather personal experience of people. And, besides as a non-Indian academic, interacting with rural Indians, one had to be mindful of, projecting dominant constructs or coming across as being not just having, a preconceived sort of an idea, but also coming across as being aggressive. So the response was, again, quote unquote, he said, they don't reveal unless they are pushed to a point, they being the respondents. And yes, so the sheer absence of ethicality and sensitivity in pushing people to reveal by resorting to questionable, supplementary questions from the irrefutable space of an outsider became very apparent. And also not to forget that the nature of these questions were both value added and hypothetical. So, and this obviously gave rise to what we call a subliminal messaging. Subliminal messaging is a strategy that is used to elicit responses in a manner that is preferred by the researchers. So subtle suggestions of religious sentiments, feelings of threat, insecurity, they were all planted as doubts and ideas in the respondent's head and to maneuver their responses. And this also, let me draw your attention to the fact that these were open-ended interviews, which were over an hour long, more, it took beyond an hour. And the influence of fatigue and, lack of vigilance on the part of respondents, along with this sort of invasive interviewing, really cannot be discounted. So that was the other factor. Then another thing I want to draw your attention to is what we call as misreading field observations. So there are ethics and predispositions of researchers that affect the research design to a large extent. And so it can not only be seen in the way the sample is drawn, but also, as we saw, during data gathering, but it also impacts data analysis. Now, analysis in phenomenological studies, like our qualitative ethnographic study, is what we call as primarily hermeneutical, which is based on the researcher's interpretation, researcher's worldview. So pretty much dependent on the perception, frame of reference, and the ideological base of the researcher. Now, in the present study that that I was involved in, the hermeneutics of the senior researcher during analysis and that of the language translators and field assistants during respondent interactions, all of them had a cumulative impact. In fact, some of the interviews were delegated to field assistants, and they brought in their additional layers of complexity in the manner of construing discussions with respondents and how they transmitted it to the senior scholars. So I just want to recount one of my interactions with one particular field assistant. She was all set to complete her undergraduate program of humanities from a well-known Indian university. And she was at this time planning to send her completed applications to two of the major American universities. And two of these were the same universities that these co-researchers of mine were already employed in as faculty. And she had discussions with them on the most persuasive socio-cultural theme to pursue in India and write up about as a statement of purpose for her research. Now, this field assistant was sent to one particular study location, and the study was pretty much to understand the interactions at the PDS outlet, PDS meaning public distribution services. That is your ration shop and the ration shop owner, and that of the beneficiaries who can avail of these PDS services. And while she was explaining her latest findings, she said that a staff member had refused to give ration to some of the people because they were not, quote unquote, they were not from the dominant religious community as the staff member. So then I looked at the transcripts that were shared by her, and religious identity had not been mentioned as an issue by any of the respondents. So to gain further clarity, I asked this FA, the field assistant, to engage in discussions with other members of the user group, but who had been given PDS supplies. And I said that let them also be from the same social demographic section as the ones who you claim were not handed over the PDS supplies. So in addition, other field researchers also joined her on the ground. Now, after a week's immersion, a significant trend began to emerge. So it became obvious that more members of the user group in the location, they belong to the same religious community, right, as the previous respondents. But there was a difference here. They had migrated to this location years ago, unlike the previous respondents who were recent migrants. And over time, they had built informal trust with the staff member, and he knew them well. So they managed to obtain ration supplies from him, even in the absence of ration cards. So it was so these were respondents who were from the same religious community, as I said, and there were others from a different religious community who had not been similarly given ration supplies because they were also recent migrants. So you understand, it became evident that religion was not critical to obtaining PDS supplies in this context. It was more about maintaining and leveraging trust with and shared context with the PDS shop owner. So, these translators had been, the other thing to remember is it's not just field assistants who had their layer of complexity, as like this example as I gave you. There were field translators who were also employed, and this was for locations that the researchers did not know the local language of. And they had been also debriefed by the donor agency and the international research agency. And they said, give us cues on caste, gender, conflict and all that, and we can work with that, just quickly as a last minute thing. So in that context, I want to give you another example. There was a long interview that had just been about to be concluded with a co-researcher of mine, along with a rural respondent, and there was a field translator as well. I happened to be present in that location, and unfortunately, I didn't know the local language because this was in one of the states of India that I was not too familiar with. And so the field translator was asked by us to check with the respondent that since it was getting a little late, whether she would be okay to just extend her interaction with us for a little more time. So the respondent was asked, and then she declined. She declined, stating that her boat, which was to ferry her from the town's marketplace back to her village, would leave in a bit, and so she was in a hurry. So guessing from the body language, we kind of picked up that she was in a hurry, and we asked the translator to tell us exactly what she said. So the translator said, she has to leave because her husband did not want her to be delayed. And so there were additional reasons, obviously, ascribed by the translator. And I got to know this only when a professional transcriber agency shared the interview transcripts with me in English, and where obviously there was no mention of the husband calling her and asking her to leave and all that. So what happens is findings are condensed for an academic audience. They're modified from a respondent's description of an event to the researcher's interpretive description. The other thing is the long extended interactions that interviewers have with the interviewees leads to some sort of, it's really good because it helps you break initial barriers of hesitance, being hesitant, lack of communication, distrust and stuff. And you can build trust, and you can kind of break the ice, so to speak. But it also leads to forging of subliminal hierarchical relations, as I call it, between scholars, that's the researchers, and the participants. And in my case, what had happened is most of the researchers who were working alongside me my co-researchers were foreign researchers. So they had extended interactions with the respondents. So their initial hesitance of the interviewees stretched to an attitude of extreme friendliness, but also an inability to refuse. And this was completely leveraged and made use of completely to elicit maximum response from people as far as possible. And so, for example, there was a senior foreign researcher. He was like the head of the international research agency, which just dropped in for a visit. And so he was with me and another researcher. And so he asked, obviously there was a translator. So he asked this rural respondent to do this. The context was to do with the kind of information that the respondents would be willing to share with medical personnel, and whether they would be okay with sharing certain kinds of medical information. So he asked what sort of information she'd be willing to share with the medical personnel, and she gave some answer. He was not satisfied with the answer, so he followed it up with what seemed like an innocuous supplementary question on emergency treatment for mental ailments and terminal illness. He said, will you be now willing to share these medical information with the medical practitioner? So she gave an answer in a certain way. And again, he was not satisfied with the kind of answer she gave. So now here is what happened. He asked her what she would do if her daughter, who was a minor, had become pregnant, but you do not know who did it to her and you want her to abort. So at that point of time, what sort of information would you share? The participant finally responded in a manner to satisfy the researcher. But it brought so many questions to my mind about her response and autonomous choice. Was it obedience coerced by someone that the respondent perceived as being in a position of dominance, including race and ethnicity? So these are all the different ways in which a foreign researcher agency and researchers can really influence data and research itself.
I mean, simply incredible. I think you just shared the inside story of how the narrative is built. The reason why this conversation is out there, that India is patriarchal, that India is unsafe for women, or that we are casteist. This is how it gets built. And it's just so sad to know what goes on in the mind of researchers, how irresponsibly they behave. And, you know, I so understand what you're saying about the way the rural people in our country respond. They are so polite and so naive that they just want to make the other person happy. And if they're pushed too far, they kind of end up giving you the answer that will make you go away happy, not realizing the bigger consequences of that. That's very sad. And it's just so unfair that that innocence of our people gets taken advantage of by such people. I just hope that more researchers would be like you, Sarita ji. And for me, that is your existence and the fact that you are part of such research and you can share these stories with us. That is the light at the end of the tunnel. And thank you for this work and for bringing this to all of us. It's so important. Thank you. Thank you so much for what you are doing.
Thank you.
Now, my next question to you is also very important. So far, we have spoken about data gathering from the field immersion exercises and all that biases that could set in when the field researcher is out there. Tell us what happens when this data is being put into a report. Are there things that can go wrong during that process as well? And what are the dangers of that process going wrong, especially when it is presented as a published paper or a set narrative? Can you please help us understand that?
Sure. So all the biases that I've mentioned earlier, particularly validation, promotion of pre-constructed theoretical paradigms, and then the framework of reference of academics, they all find their way into data analysis and finally in the report that gets published. So now biases are typically rationalized by appending in the report, in the research report, what they call as the reflexivity section. So there is a reflexivity section. It may or may not go by that name, but there definitely is a place where the researchers sort of look back in retrospect at the kind of research they have done in the in the big research report. Now, what happens is biases are typically rationalized by appending this sort of a reflexivity section. And think of all the biases and all the unethical practices that I have mentioned earlier. All this gets rationalized in the report through the reflexivity section, or the reflexive way of writing. And unethical crafting of research design and interviewing of interviewing of users are justified in this manner. So it is actually, it is used to rationalize the method of data analysis. Typically, that's the reason that there is a reflexivity section. But what happens is the way in which it's written up these days, it just becomes a practice of putatively validating pre-constructed theoretical constructs. And these are further strengthened by the senior researchers' confirmation biases, which also they bring in. So the reflexive sort of writing, or the reflexivity section that gets added in what we call as research reports becomes a practice of merely vindicating pre-mediated conclusions. So in the words of a senior academic researcher, I remember in one of the projects that I was in, he had said, reflexivity is not the place where we admit our blunders. So basically you have retrofitted rationalization of research design when you have this sort of a thing going on. The other thing is biases also drive pre-decided codes that are kind of force-fitted into data analysis. So for instance, can you imagine the whole PDS supply in rural area scenario that I had shared with you in my previous example, which was really about trust and information networks in the village economy. Can you imagine how incorrectly it will be transposed into a framework of religious tension? So that's one of the things. So all this has deep ramifications for the context that is studied, which is India. And it is significant that in a non-Western context, such as India's, that is guided by dominant constructs, it influences our social, our cultural, and even our political narratives. So if we as a nation want to reclaim the credibility of research in the non-Western context, I think a first step is to examine factors that aid in distorting the sort of primary research, and thereby the whole academic knowledge repository that gets built up. So the thing to remember is ours being a multicultural country, we are even more vulnerable to skewed study outcomes due to these kinds of predetermined constructs, and these will impact our sociocultural paradigms, the narratives, and most importantly, current administrative policies, because it's sad that it leads to stereotypes, falsely constructed narratives of a conflict-ridden society, and fabricated competitive victimhood stories globally. So these are the kind of things that get projected abroad in international field studies and researches and their publications.
So true, Sarita ji, and thanks for sharing that. And this isn't just the case with India. I imagine with most studies happening in the so-called developing world, a very similar pattern of research emerges. There's this beautiful article written by Dr. Subhash Kakji in the platform called Medium, where he mentions that a survey published in Nature in 2016 reported that researchers had been unable to reproduce over 70% of the findings of other scientists. He further quotes, Richard Houghton, who's the editor of Lancet, wrote that the case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. In a well-known paper, a Stanford professor said that most published results are false, and they merely present the prevailing biases in a dressed-up manner. So my question to you, Saritaji, is do you agree that this is how it happens? Although they might be talking in the context of quantitative studies, do you think this is also true of qualitative research? And according to you, what percentage of published research, qualitative research, might actually be biased and unreliable? And what is the way forward to rectify the many problems that we have discussed so far?
Right. It's absolutely true. It's true of quantitative study. It's true of qualitative study. It's true of studies that are undertaken even in the, not just in the medical field, the behavioral sciences as well. In fact, all research, as I say, is guided by subjectivity. And in fact, subjectivity is what inspires one to undertake any study. So to that extent, subjectivity is good. But when subjectivity drives one to abandon ethics and adopt biases, that's where we have a problem. So every primary qualitative study is likely to be jeopardized by these very shortcomings. So to set things right, I feel researchers must first share the limitations of their study design, just as they now share the motivations of their study in the report. Similarly, instead of rationalizing their methods and findings, let them just leave it to the readers to arrive at their own conclusions. Like that is how the study really ought to be presented. In terms of actual data gathering and analysis, I feel here is what can be done. In fact, one of the ways to overcome dominant theoretical constructs in qualitative studies is what we call as convergent confirmability. So weakness of one method can be compensated by advantages of another. Also, independent measures that are undertaken by following one particular method will not have the same biases. Moreover, if you have multiple research teams with varied skills, and if they are brought forth to work together, they can actually cross-validate each other's observations during field interactions. So for instance, certain aspects of social conflict within the community, when they were claimed to have been revealed in the funded project with its open-ended guided interviews, this could have been validated by another research team through participatory workshops with the same community. I'm just giving possible ways of overcoming this. And the other thing is, especially in social sciences, where you have researchers who are pretty much followers of dominant paradigms and theoretical constructs, it would be a good idea to get researchers who owe their allegiance to eclectic schools of thought. And they should be encouraged to collaborate and verify the research team's conclusions. So ideally, it should be in a culturally diverse team. There should be scholars who are trained in India-specific perspectives of culture theories to critique the preconceived codes, like I mentioned, the preconceived codes during analysis of caste or gender, and the dominant language, conceptual language that is used therein. So such scholars can have pre-study discussions with the research team and start probing the classification of Indian society into these archetypes. So because the categorization into caste was actually done by British, as we saw in our earlier discussion, that it was during the European cultural experience and how they perceived, sought to perceive what they experienced in India. In fact, research debates should be directed at deconstructing this whole moral discourse around India's caste system. And in fact, it appears to be almost identical in its structure to that of the Christian missionaries in the 19th century. In other words, there is a visible advocacy of critically analyzing established methods in the West. But such critical standpoints are overlooked in analyzing India's socio-cultural norms. So the thing about qualitative study is that its inductive and reflexive structure makes it very amenable to handle new data that comes in and take it forth for analysis. So I feel with that being a strong point, data points should be revisited at any time to bring in theoretical ideas. But with pre-identified coding mechanisms that they have, under which they try to bracket all the findings. The template analysis, as they call it, that should be discarded. And what I feel is with preconceived templates of codes during analysis, what happens is scholars are required to weave in their own interpretations and theoretical perspective, and they transpose that onto the descriptive data that comes from respondents from the field. So, that's problematic, because every scholar has a philosophical orientation one way or the other, and that determines the study method right down to data analysis. So, in fact, what they say is that in ethnographic qualitative studies, they say that researchers should develop their analysis first and then acquaint the readers with it, and then proceed to, prove it with quotes. Now, that's fine as far as a write-up is concerned, where you're actually putting forth your findings. You do it in this manner. But if it's not a research paper, and if it's an actual study where you are following these kinds of axioms, then you're formalizing cherry picking, and you're also constricting studies to follow the constructed paradigms of scholars. So what I espouse is a grounded theory approach, or at least a modification of grounded theory, where you analyze qualitative data in terms of the user's quotes and users' descriptive statements that will come in the form of open discussions. So you will not go to the field with a preconceived code saying that I'm going to gather data on, of a conflict-ridden society, of a caste oppressive kind of a society, or these kinds of things. Instead, if it's an open-ended discussion with the users, I will let my theory develop during analysis bottom up from the user quotes. So coding will occur in terms of concurrence of user statements, and theoretical constructs will emerge, but they'll emerge bottom up. So an interdisciplinary research team should preferably undertake this grounded theory analysis, in my opinion. And this will give scholars from different academic disciplines and different epistemologies an opportunity to assess the internal validity of the research design, the credibility of data, and they can call forth bias, as I said earlier, call forth bias in this interpretivist account that dominates the study of inquiry. Also, researchers, if this happens, they will remain true to the data from the field. And also, the other thing is, with a diverse team that collaborates in this manner, it's quite possible that they will not reach consensus when they are analyzing data, but it will enable, it will facilitate coding and diverging and synthesizing of data in a much more effective manner, where the goal of such an exercise would really be to take out, to weed out individual prejudices of researchers and gain better accuracy and uphold the ethical interpretation of data. Because finally, qualitative study is based on contextual immersion, and that can be made credible if feedback from users in the form of cross verification is incorporated right into the research design. So veracity of data can be established, and at the same time, even the individual dominant perspectives, theoretical paradigms also can be addressed. So these are some of the suggestive measures to clean up one's house, as I say it.
Thank you, Sarita ji. I think those are very practical methods, provided the researchers have the intent of going about it in an unbiased manner. And we hope that as more and more common people become aware of how most of the narratives there are agenda-driven, researchers will become more conscious of going about it using the methods that you suggested. We hope that happens. My last question to you, Sarita ji, is this. What would you suggest to a layperson who is in fact the target audience of such research as to how they can watch out for the inherent bias and separate fact from the agenda-driven fiction presented as published research?
So at the very outset, readers should first make themselves aware of the journal, the magazine, the blog or organization or the channel that has published this research. So, we speak of brand awareness as a strategy for marketing for the FMCG industry. So I call for channel awareness. So that awareness is possible by reading and making oneself familiar with previous publications in that forum. And that will give us a fair idea of the content that is popularized by the forum. We should also make ourselves familiar with the previous works or the other works of either the researchers or the study team, the individual researchers or the team that has brought forth a research publication. So if we do that, we become better acquainted with their theoretical paradigms and approaches and how they have undertaken this study. So we should also make ourselves, the other thing is we should also make ourselves familiar with other studies or scholars who have refuted this kind of research and the specific objections to this research that we are reading, right now suppose we are reading in any forum. And we try to understand what their objections were, from the other school of thought. Are these valid objections? And if we can arrive at that conclusion by reading more from other schools of thought and their line of reasoning and how well their argument is posited, we'll be better equipped, is what I think. One of the direct ways of checking for agenda-driven fiction is to simply examine how the research has been presented. So our discussion earlier or so far has been on biases and ethics. And I'm sure that will have given our audience a clue on how that can be done, how we can get to it, how we can pinpoint it. So what one should do is check for consistency right from the start, where a study asserts is its research objective and research design. We need to ask, what are the accompanying hypotheses and research questions? Check if they are congruent. What is the criteria for selecting a sample of study and the methods that they have employed to gather data? Is it in consonance with the stated objectives and the research problem? Then is there enough transparency and consistency? And how exactly was the data analyzed? So, and the other thing to find, to look for is why did the study make this specific inference? And did this specific inference come from findings? Was there enough evidence in the findings to actually point towards this sort of an inference? So if the answer to all these questions has us convinced, then the study or the researcher has done a good job. If not, we need to get our objections heard, because I think this is exactly how the lens needs to be switched.
Absolutely. Very informative, Sarita ji. And I hope that our viewers got an insight into how these things are cooked up and created, and that each of us, even though we may not come from a research background, we have a responsibility to check what is put out there in the name of research, and not just jump to conclusions that the minute a paper is published, it is the ultimate truth. So keep that in mind when we go out there and try to look for papers and look for evidence. And just because it is published in some scientific journal, it need not be unbiased. So I hope that the viewers will keep in mind what Sarita ji has shared with us today, and become more responsible as citizens, and become aware also, if we are on the receiving end, if we are the subjects being studied, be very careful of what you communicate and what the reason for them asking those questions might be. Be aware of that as well. And if you have roots in rural India, make it a point to help our rural people become aware of this, so that they don't get used to present information that is agenda driven. Sarita ji, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Very informative, very enlightening discussion. Dhanyavad, namaste, and hope to have you back on Festival of Bharat one more time.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.